Welcome to People Are the Point. I'm your host, Mark Concannon. Let's talk about the people. Hello, I'm your host, Mark Concannon, for People Are the Point. Today, we have a special session. Specifically, I have David Hidger joining me. He has a master's from Johns Hopkins, spent some time in the energy industry to the point at which he was presenting at conferences on that industry and the change that is part of it and its future. Now he helps my organization dive deep with specific clients, especially today with the leading automotive manufacturer in the world, as we work on mobility and the changes to our everyday lives. We had the fortune of going to the Consumer Electronics Show just last week. What was a lot of fun was seeing not only David's viewpoint on the technology coming, but how it's going to affect all of us in our daily lives and how we target which generation for adoption. Please enjoy the show. David, thank you for joining me today.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
So I remember you did a great job helping me do my first episode of this podcast, getting the stage set. I appreciate you coming back again. I want to talk a little about how we're seeing technology, especially bleeding edge components, applying to all of us in our life. And you and I got to go to CES this last week. What did you think of the show?
I'm off fresh from the show. It'd been my first time to see CES in person. I'd always kind of followed it online. You get to see the articles, the breaking news, the YouTube recaps where people break down what's out there. And then getting to see it for the first time was really, really cool. That my first impression is just the scale and the size of it. It was 134,000 people, something like that, across all of the different halls. I was really impressed with just how big it was. I think we saw like 11 different keyboard manufacturers. So you can find niches everywhere for somebody doing something in tech. And it was neat to kind of see what's being worked on and what's not.
Well, that's what I found so interesting was that why do we need that many keyboard manufacturers? But obviously they exist because there's a different niche, to your point, and all the components. So although a lot of what we spend our time on is mobility and automotive, I know especially that's what you've been working on recently. What did you feel like you saw this time around that maybe wasn't what you expected?
Yeah, I think my initial impressions, especially in the automotive space, were one of job security. You see lots of people talking about vehicles as software-defined vehicles, SDVs, and I think there's some mystery around what exactly people mean by it. And I like the simplest definition of just being vehicles that are primarily operated or improved functionality through software as opposed to hardware or buttons. There's, I think, an online debate about if you should have all software or some hard buttons, right? Like that's more of a user experience. But so many of the automotive manufacturers and people who supply automotive manufacturers were talking about SDVs, what the future looks like. I think in past years, we've heard AI used a lot as kind of a buzzword and a term that just garnered interest. But this year, it really felt like people had started to find genuine use cases to say, here's how we're going to integrate this AI or this AI-driven component to improve like a real problem that people are facing rather than putting it up there as a slogan to get attention. And so I think it's interesting to see just how many use cases have kind of been validated and have an AI solution that's being rolled out into the market.
Well, I know AI is one piece of the software. What else, what do you think is if this vision of, Tesla's often held up as the first model of software first kind of mentality. How do you think that's going to change our use of the vehicle, the experience for our children? Like, where do you think that it applies for us in the real world?
Yeah, I think there are two big things that are driving it right now. The first is more immediate, and the second I think is down the road. But the first being that I think people have developed a familiarity with tech based on their cell phone, right? Like that's the piece of technology that we seem to be using the most, that we have the most touch points with, that we have the most familiarity with. And vehicles today don't operate like your cell phone. So if the user experience and expectation is to have a software interface that is like a cell phone, the automotive industry has a long way to come. And I think that we're starting to see the beginnings of that as we see the OEMs really acknowledge, and of course their partners acknowledge that that's the experience that customers want. So we need to try and find a way to align with that more closely. And that comes with, okay, well then we need more data. I thought we had a lot of data. We do have a lot of data, but we need even more data. So now it's talking about the sensors, the LiDAR, the connectivity. How do we get the data off? If I had my crystal ball, one of the big changes I think we're going to see coming is there are so many computational resources that are required that they're going to get centralized, that we don't need, 100, 200 differentiated ECUs on a vehicle, that you need 3 or 4 central computing units and then let them manage all of that capacity over time, because maybe something needs a large amount of that computing for a very short period of time. but you can't have it distributed in order for it to have the total amount of computing that it's needed for whatever the use case is. And so I think we're seeing that it becomes more and more phone-like, which is why we're seeing the software-defined vehicles fixing OTA updates, just pushing something over the air to get something fixed inside the vehicle. It offers more functionality. You know, some people throw around the term future-proof. I don't think it future-proofs the vehicles, but it certainly gives them a facelift. It allows it to be updated a little more frequently. You get a new phone maybe 2, 3, every 4 years, but most people aren't getting a new vehicle every 2, 3, or 4 years. So it's going to extend the life and the relevancy of the technology in the car for the consumer. And then I think on the second side, the longer term vision of it, what I think this technology is showing us is as cars become more and more capable of driving themselves, the driving experience becomes less important for the customer. It's now about the vehicle as an experience to get from point A to point B, and less about the vehicle as its ability to do vehicle things, right? We're not worried about torque, horsepower, miles per gallon. We're more interested in, as a person sitting in the vehicle, what is my comfort? What is my experience? How do I get from A to B? And what are the benefits that the vehicle is providing to me during that journey, rather than the specs of a vehicle, which I think we've seen.
Well, this always makes me think about, in concept, it's most likely once, say we go to level 5, there's not even a steering wheel anymore. It's going to force all of us to get really good at time management. There is no speed up and make up a difference, or even the perception of it. It's going to be, when it says Google Maps says from point A to point B, it's 15 minutes, it's going to be 15 minutes. So, but to your point, that 15 minutes is about probably comfort and what I can be doing in the vehicle. I'm no longer worrying, do I hear the engine inside, which you might want in a sports car. That sort of, to your point, little experiences shift to comfort and ease and away from driving experience.
Yeah, I remember seeing outside of the automotive hall, one of the vehicles that they were showing off actually had a table that kind of popped up. It reminded me almost like the back of a boat, where you can get the table out from underneath the seat cushions and put a table in the kind of the center back of a boat if you're out sitting on the lake. And so seeing that, it was a very familiar scene from a boat, but put kind of on 4 wheels, is, I think, possibly what the future might look like for vehicle transportation, especially just casual travel between point A and point B, where you have maybe 4 people around a table as the vehicle is kind of just taking care of you getting from A to B.
Well, I know it's a piece of what the Delta Airlines CEO came on and said, we should see flying taxis in operation in the next couple of years. And so depending on what those models look like in terms of pickup and drop-off points, some of the pieces, that also becomes almost competitive with our autonomous vehicles, where I'm able to move even faster between points and still just a sitting experience, not flight.
Yeah, well, and I love the market. I like letting the market solve these kind of thorny challenges. And so the more options people have to get from point A to point B, we start to self-select. And I think there will be pressures that push people to use one technology over the other, and how quickly they adapt, or what market they're trying to capture. So the more options that there are available, I think it ultimately ends up being better for everybody that's trying to.
Yeah, I agree. I think something you and I talked about when we're looking at all the different technologies coming, especially for mobility, and there is Mobileye and Waymo and these different devices that are more focused on level 5, and who's the real target. And I think you and I talked a lot about, getting the past generation, say my father's generation, to adopt isn't going to be as critical as getting me to adopt and then setting up so that my daughter would adopt. What are your thoughts there on why those priorities are shifting?
Yeah, I think there's definitely a skew to recognizing which customers are most likely to accept the technology. The younger we get, the more excited they seem to be about technology. I also think the less frequent or common it is for them to have spent a long time driving. And so it's easy to give up something that you haven't always been doing. And, as humans, we know change can be difficult. If you've been driving for the last 60 years, getting into a vehicle and not trusting it, or let alone even having a steering wheel, could be a big ask for somebody that's been doing it for so long. Whereas I think our children, they may never even get a driver's license, right? Like they might just say like, oh, I've always let the vehicle drive around, and the terms automatic and manual vehicles will be redefined, not to refer to the transmission, but to who's actually operating the vehicle, right? That you and I will be manual drivers, and our children will be like, Dad, like you don't have to do that. Just get in the car. It'll take you there. Trust it. It'll be okay.
Now, along these lines, we're also seeing there was a couple new electric vehicle manufacturers popping up. When we're hearing so many challenges in automotive, organizations like Rivian have been in financial trouble, Tesla's not shipping as expected. What are your thoughts on what's bringing them into the space and what their future might look like given the situation today?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of optimism around the EV space generally, to say that there are headwinds there today, but that in the future it will be better. I think the most compelling argument for that, to be frank, is if you look at renewable energy production, it's been on the rise. And so as you can decrease the total cost of ownership by making the fuel inside the vehicle relatively cheap compared to an alternative, this becomes a compelling kind of business case to say we should be making more EVs. Of course, we're not there today. I think especially across the US, there are challenges with the EV infrastructure. They're being addressed, but they're not a tomorrow thing, right? This is not a switch that we can just flip. That there are real challenges to adopting EVs. I think that today there are really strong use cases for them for anybody that's commuting less than 30 miles. In fact, we saw the one vehicle, it was totally solar powered, right? It had a 40-mile radius. I wouldn't take it all the way to the end of its 40-mile radius, but if you've got a 5-mile commute and you can have something that's totally driven by the power of the sun, that might be something worth looking into, especially if it's a relatively low price point to get in. Currently, a lot of the successful EVs on the market are treated almost like luxury vehicles of where they're marked compared to some of their hybrid or ICE competitors. But as we see those prices begin to fall, as we see some familiarity across the industry as far as what the dominant design is for an EV, I see more and more people adopting that as a way to get around. I don't know if it'll ever replace all of the internal combustion engines on the road, right? Some of these rural areas or long distances or times where you need fast refueling times may always necessitate an engine rather than just motors and a battery. But for the vast majority of us, right, I could see in the next 10, 20 years, it being the primary mode of transportation.
So agreed. Well, I think what I found interesting too was at the show, there was these kinds of conversations where you've got major organizations that are offering consumer solutions, but really to other business buyers. But you also had the 116-inch TV. So it's a broad range of consumer components. Do we need a 116-inch TV? I don't know. What did you think about the race to be bigger on TVs?
I thought that we had hit some of our max TV sizes, and evidently I was wrong. I always thought that there was a turning point where it was just better to have a projector and a screen that you put it on. But, Hisense, I think they had 116 or maybe even one slightly bigger than that was out there on the floor. And then you look at it and you start to wonder, like, how do you actually get it into the home? It starts to become, the dimensions are so large that it doesn't fit through your standard doorway. So are we building the house around the TV? Are you putting it in non-residential areas? The use case isn't always super clear. Maybe you just take out the doorway to get the TV in and then you build it back after the fact. I'm not quite sure, but it was impressive to see the TVs that large. The pictures were so clear. Even those had AI like upscaling as far as like the visual quality. And so everybody's finding a way to mix in AI. I saw a lot more robotics than I anticipated seeing out there. There were some general use cases, both residential, commercial, industrial, where people say, hey, look, this is what our robotics can do now. And so that's exciting to see kind of coming along the way.
What are your thoughts on that? I know there's already a pretty dynamic robot that you can get for, I think, like $15,000 today. And all of its function, I'm not sure. I know it's mobile like a human, but if it's as dexterous and programmable is not clear. I could do some more research. But what do you think about that if we have Elon as a vision of every human has a robot or two to act as, butler, maids, and things like this? Do you see that as something we want roaming our homes as extra humans that are just serving us with their robots? Or do you feel like, it's going to take a longer time for us to adapt?
Yeah, I think as people start to realize the use cases that the robots can fulfill for them, they may quickly adopt them. I view robotics potentially like the ATM, where it's just benefits for everybody involved, and not waiting in line to talk to a bank teller is so beneficial for the individual trying to pull money out of their account. It's beneficial for the bank trying to operate the exchange of money from an account, that it becomes kind of widely accepted, widely distributed, sort of all on its own. Those use cases, look, there are chores in everybody's house that we don't really want to do, but they need to get done. And so to the extent that I could outsource that to a machine to do it successfully, as long as there aren't risks around safety, security, and privacy, I think people are going to start to invite more and more robotic support to take care of some of the mundane tasks that we know need to be done, but just aren't real interested in doing. We watched one demonstration, and one thing that kind of surprised me but made a lot of sense was it was loading the dishwasher, right? It was like a big robotic arm on a demonstration kitchen, and it was very slow. I was like, yeah, it's really slow. But if it's loading the dishwasher while you're watching the TV or playing with the kids or hanging out outside, it doesn't have to be fast, right? It just needs to not break the dishes as it's putting them in and out. And so maybe some of at least my initial assumptions of what the robotics need to do to be successful may not be right? That we're going to see it get challenged. The things we actually care about and what we thought we might care about when it comes to robotics may not align on a list. And so it'll be interesting to see as these robotics get moved to the market and the early adopters get their hands on them, what the feedback is and what the use cases are that they find to be highly useful or familiar for themselves.
Yeah, because to your point, you're putting a robot hand on a line to build vehicles. You want it to be fast because you need to keep that line moving as fast as possible. You're just trying to get your dishes done. Now, we need the dishes to not all be plastic, which is a different issue. That was the demo. But I think we're going to solve some of those problems in the long run. And that's where it becomes, okay, that was just a hand that did these pieces. What if it was a robot in the room that's fully mobile and go to all the different stations? A real game changer in the long run. So of what you saw, what do you think kind of stands out that you think will affect our children as these are bleeding edge pieces to some extent right now, coming to market, the future? When do you think more of this is a ubiquitous, and what do you think is more of the higher impact ones?
Yes, I think one of the highest impact is going to be what vehicles look like in the future, right? There was so much emphasis on the user experience inside of a vehicle, and even the phraseology of that, right? When you would talk to the vendors and talk to folks, like, we're not talking about the driving experience or the driver. We're talking about the user experience of this piece of technology. And it's less about being a passenger in the car and a user inside of a piece of tech that you're experiencing and what that interaction looks like. I imagine that we will continue to see infotainment systems that are just leaps and bounds better than what has been put in the market over the last 10, 15 years. I think we'll see some consolidation, centralization to say people really like A and they really don't like B. And so that's the way everybody does it. If voice command really takes over, maybe we don't see the return of some of the hard buttons. But if it doesn't, I can see a space where people are always going to want to have 3 or 4 things that they can just press and get their hands on very quickly. Climate control, radio volume, on, off, like these things seem to see universal support to say, like, I want to be able to touch this in my car. Whether or not that carries on to future generations, I'm not sure, but that seems to be something that I think it'll just look so different. Like when we look back and talk about our driving experience, maybe even it'll be something we'll be criticized for. Like, you guys trusted 16-year-olds to go 80 miles an hour down the highway with a cell phone in their hand. And we're like, yeah, we told them not to look at their cell phone, but that was just the way it was. We didn't have a better alternative. And they'll be like, wow, that's really wild. And maybe in a similar way, robotics, right? You see robotics in surgery. Maybe there's a future where people are looking back at this and be like, you just let people operate on people. Or like, that was the only choice. Like, yeah, this is a way better alternative. And some of those robotics had really fine controls and really precise movements, but we don't have access to those today. So I think as we move into the future, those are things that will be kind of judged in retrospect. And I'm not sure how we'll score, but we're doing the best we can for what we've got.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Well, I know one thing that didn't get a lot of attention. So I know you mentioned this is your first CES. I've been to some others before, and some of them got more attention around quantum computing. And so not only did I really not see a lot of presence on that topic, but then the NVIDIA CEO came out and said, we're 20 years away from practical application. What are your thoughts there? Do you think that that's why we didn't see a lot of it? Or do you think that we're so on AI and robots right now, we're less concerned about quantum?
Yeah, not an expert on quantum computing, but from everything that I've heard, if we get good at it, it causes us lots of problems, right? So much of our security, passwords, encryption are predicated on non-quantum computing standards. I don't know what that looks like in the coming years, but I will say that we've seen the technology curve kind of accelerate over time, right? That we think certain things are 15, 20, 30 years down the road, and then they end up 2 or 3 years down the road. At the same time, I think if you look back at the 70s, people said that nuclear energy was going to be the thing that produced energy for the world, and it was just 5, 10 years away. And so I think it really comes down to priority, right? If there's enough interest and valid use cases behind it that people say, hey, we have to do this, you get the interest going behind it, the technology gets developed and matured, it gets put out into the market sooner. I think there are people who are very invested in quantum computing. They want to see it come to market. And if I were to take the over or under, I would put it at under 20 years. But then it gets into the mess of like, well, what do you define exactly as a widespread use of quantum computing? So we'll see what the future holds, but I think it's going to come sooner than we're.
Yeah, and I know that's a big piece of it is the security and how do we live securely in that world. But on the flip side, there's so much that isn't secure already. So much of the data that we just allow corporations to take. To your point about all of the data we're already collecting, and now we're just going to collect more. I know that's one of the things I found really interesting as we've done more in the senior living space and learned about how technology is coming there to help keep privacy and safety, and how we've moved away from camera and into more other wavelengths so that we can still, quote, see, but we're not really looking at the person. I know we saw some of that there too. That's a little bit of the LiDAR technologies, things along those lines. How do you see other industries, or that's probably, we talked about automotive already, probably senior living. What are your thoughts about that approach and the shift away from maybe visual light?
Yeah, so it was very prominent, right? You saw all the other types of sensors and radars, and they're all on the electromagnetic spectrum, but some of them are outside of the wavelengths that we can see. We saw immediate use cases in gaming, right, where you saw people using the haptic feedback and the way that they were tracking players within a given space and allowing them to interact with people who weren't, geophysically co-located with them. And I think that's really interesting. I think adding that component with the ability for AI to generate kind of new content, new interactions over time, that you start to have more and more genuine feeling interactions, which is cool. Like, I'm excited to see what that looks like. Being able to offer that to people who are in some way limited with their ability to either move, get around, be it age or sickness. This offers them a lot of entertainment opportunities that they might otherwise not have had. But when we look at the robotics in particular, I think robotics is going to have widespread use cases, right, where you can use it across tons of industries. I don't know of anybody, I'm sure somebody exists, but I don't know of anybody who is excited to clean the bathroom, right? That's just a task that has to get done. And if I can send it off to a robot to take care of it, that'd be great, right? Like, that's it. Most bathrooms are relatively well defined. We know what the criteria are. We know what needs to get clean. This is great. Are there security concerns about the robot in the bathroom? Maybe, but hopefully those are pretty minimal. And as we move towards the future, you get those benefits with relatively limited downsides.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. So your first time, you feel like it went well. In the future, well, was there one major takeaway? I mean, I feel like the volume of people is obviously a big deal. We heard it takes a year. They starting now on next year. It's like there's constant planning and thousands of people to make this thing happen. Was there any major takeaways you had from the show?
Yeah, I had two. I think in my role as like an automotive analyst, the thing that I was most interested in was talking to a lot of the vendors that support OEMs and just how many of them want to push things to the edge, right? That they recognize the data transmission costs to send, store, and compute all of that data in the cloud it becomes cost prohibitive as you want to do more and more because you need more and more data. And so many of the folks that we talked to said, no, we do it on the edge, and then kind of like a test result, you just send the answer, right? So you collect the data, you analyze the data, you make your decision, and then you just share the decision with the cloud. So it's still connected, but you can reduce how much data has to get sent from maybe megabytes of data being sent, kilobytes of data being sent on a daily basis for a given use case. And to me, that's pretty exciting, right? I think that's something where the industry will move. And it's why I think we'll see the consolidation of computing resources on vehicle frames, because there's going to be use cases that need a large amount of processing power for a short period of time. And then you can free up that processing power to go do something else on the vehicle. In my non-automotive analyst hat, it's a fun reminder of just how quirky humans are, that there are people there who dive so deep into one specific area, right? Samsung had an entire setup where they were talking about their smart hubs for ship, right? So being able to have the Internet of Things devices connected all together for a ship. It's not in use anywhere. They built an example of it and they said, here's the industry that we think we could go use it on. And there must have been 10, 20 people who were prepared to talk about it. And so I can only assume that's hundreds or thousands of people on the back end that have spent years of their lives working on this just one piece of technology, which is integrating the Internet of Things on ships. And to think about each booth having PhD level researchers and professionals that have spent their career around just doing one thing is a fresh reminder that, like, we all enjoy this technology and it didn't just come about by accident, that it's a very intentional effort for us to drive things forward. And I find that very optimistic and reassuring as a species that, like, yeah, these are tough problems and they take a lot of time, but we are able to break it down into its composite chunks and solve those one at a time to build it up to give us something really, really great.
No, it is exciting. Well, I look forward to us next year, see what else is coming up. I think it's been a few years off with COVID and whatnot. So I feel like there's been a real shift, which has been fun from the last time that at least we as an organization had gone. And now I'm really looking forward to seeing how the next year goes. 'Cause to your point, I think technology is accelerating even faster.
Enjoy the technology and looking forward to going back to CES.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you, David, for the time.